Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Craig Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from media, sports, culture, nature, politics, and more. On this episode, I talk with Emily Mills, a weekly opinion columnist for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel and the editor of Our Lives, Madison's LGBTQ magazine. I talked to Mills about what it's like to write about politics and to be active on social media in a culturally divisive era. Mills also reflects on reporting on 2011's massive protests at the Wisconsin State Capitol in response to Governor Scott Walker's legislation to limit the collective bargaining of public sector unions. And we also talk about Mills's other passions, including punk music and roller derby. Well, maybe I'll just, the first place to start maybe is like, where do you come from?
Well, I've lived in Madison since 2000. I came up here for school. Actually went to Edgewood College, not the UW. Before that, I was living in Oklahoma for a couple of years. Before that, Northern Illinois. Before that, Minnesota. So my father is a Presbyterian minister, and you move from time to time. Not quite as much as a military brat, but kind of up there. The fellow PKs will get it.
Yeah, so what was that like growing up, moving around a lot?
I actually really appreciate it. I think more in retrospect than I did at the time. You know, when you're living it, it's hard to kind of see what good comes of that. But it was actually really good to get different perspectives and meet different people and experience living in different parts of the country, especially Oklahoma. I was there for my junior and senior year of high school, and it was pretty traumatic to move there at that point. I moved right after my sophomore year. But it ended up actually being a really good thing for me. Disabused me of a lot of stereotypes I had of people from that area. I met a lot of really awesome people. It's actually the first place I ever came out as queer. Weirdly enough, I actually felt more comfortable in the crew I fell into in Oklahoma than I ever had in Northern Illinois, if you can believe that. It was interesting, but I ended up, I think I got a better perspective and learned a lot, and it got me out of some ruts. Like, you sort of fall into what you're supposed to be in a certain friend group. I was able to kind of shake that off a couple of times and continue to actually grow and change and evolve like you're supposed to as a human being a little bit more easily.
So what was it like coming out as queer when you have a father who's a religious person, who's preaching? And I mean, what's that like?
I have probably the easiest story of them all when it comes to that. My father's always been pretty darn progressive. I mean, he's sort of like an old school progressive, and certainly didn't always understand what it was all about, but he was ahead of the curve in terms of, like, he was part of a movement in the Presbyterian Church as long ago as the 70s and 80s to get LGBT inclusive policies and welcoming and stuff like that before he knew he had queer kids. So my older sister came out before me. And I remember I used to, like, when I was a young teenager, and I'd be like, well, I can't possibly be queer because you can only have one queer person in a family, right? Like, there can't be more than one. Everybody would just think I was copying her. So he'd already been through it with my sister. And was totally, I mean, he was, again, like, doesn't quite understand everything, but he's willing to sort of admit that, which I appreciated. And he was never mean about it. Like, he was always very accepting. I don't mention my mother a lot because unfortunately she passed away when I was 15, and she'd been sick for a couple of years leading up to that. So I think she was only kind of vaguely aware that we were coming out around that time. Because unfortunately her sickness meant that she wasn't always mentally present. But I believe that she would have probably been similar in terms of just, like, not entirely understanding it, but she always supported us and accepted us. Like, my sister and I were always huge rebellious tomboys. We didn't want to wear dresses, and she was always trying to dress us as little dolls. She wanted the little frilly outfits in her little girls, and we just were not into it. And bless her, she finally was like, okay, I'm okay with this. I will support you for who you are. So yeah, all things considered, actually, my friends who didn't have clergy as parents had a much harder time with stuff like that than I did.
You moved around a lot, you were saying, and eventually you got to Madison for college, and you stayed around Madison. So why didn't you move somewhere else? I mean, obviously, somebody who's used to moving around, I think, is probably more willing to take a leap and go somewhere else across the country if they want, because they're just not as tied maybe to a location. But is there something about Madison that you just kind of fell in love with?
I think it's a combination. And I think that point about having moved a bit when I was growing up, I was kind of subconsciously looking for a place to have roots, to have a community that I could build. And I wasn't actively trying to build that at the time. But so when I moved up here for school, I never lived on campus. I moved into an apartment with a couple of friends that I'd had who were at the UW and some people that I didn't know. It was great. So I had this, and I had to stay during the summers. I didn't go back. I didn't go back to Oklahoma. I had to stay here and work basically to make things work. And I wasn't super interested in going hanging out in Oklahoma in the summertime is not fun. It's real hot. And so I think just because I was staying here during the breaks, I was really getting a chance to see right away what Madison is like. So I started to fall in love with Madison as a city and as a place really quickly. I always tell the story that when I was first visiting Madison, when I was still in high school, I was coming up to visit my friends because they were a year ahead of me. And I had like the most kind of stereotypical for that time Madison treatment. So I got picked up at the airport by my friend and her boss, who she was then working for The Onion. And her boss was Stephen Thompson, who's now on NPR and music. He was the AV Club editor at the time. So they pick me up from the airport. They take me to State Street. So the first thing I see is State Street in the year 2000, which is its own thing. Coming from Oklahoma, mind you, there's nothing. They take me to the Onion offices. And while I'm there visiting with my friends, we go see like an Ani DeFranco concert at the Orpheum and all this other stuff. It was just like, oh my God, there's culture here and there's really cool people. Like, what is this magical place? So yeah, I mean, as an 18-year-old who's sort of just kind of coming out and trying to find her way and all that, it's pretty, makes a mark. But then staying here and actually working here made a huge difference as well. And I started to build roots, basically is what it did. And then so right after I graduated, I think if I had moved right then, it would have been fine to a degree, and I had thought about it, but I ended up getting involved in a bunch of stuff in the area in terms of like theater and some grassroots press, and so that was like Dame 101 came shortly after that, was a website I was involved in. And I was just like, well, there's so much to do here, and I really like this place. For all of Madison's many, many faults, don't get me wrong, there's problems here, and when I go to big cities especially, I'm like, oh, I'm surrounded by a wide variety of people, and it's really refreshing, and I miss that. For all of that, I decided this was a place I wanted to stay and fight for.
Everybody gets that question when they're at a party, like, what do you do, right? So, and I know you do a lot of things.
Yeah,
so
there's a list.
So I want to know, like, what is your answer to that question?
Yeah. So when I'm asked that, the short answer is that I am a writer and a musician. Those are sort of my two biggest things. And then, of course, roller derby comes up because I can't not talk about that. But if we're giving like official titles, I am the editor of Our Lives magazine, which is the LGBTQ magazine in Madison. I have been for about 5 years now, I want to say. That's my full-time gig. And then I have a freelance weekly column that I write for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. But I also play in bands in town. I'm in the band Damsel Trash. I used to be in a band called Little Red Wolf, which never officially broke up. Might do things down the line. Who knows? Yeah. And then, roller derby, activism, just kind of a busybody, basically. I like to do things and meet people.
What drives you to be so engaged in all the different things? I mean, some people have one thing they do after work, or why all these different things? Why music? Why roller derby? I mean, what drives you to do all these things?
That's like a fundamental question about my personality, my soul. I think I've always been like that. Part of me kind of has always wished, man, it would be nice if you could just focus on one thing and get really good at that one thing and really see it through. And I think sometimes I do shoot myself in the foot by being involved in like so many things that you can never really dig into any one of them. But then I'm like, that's not entirely true. I have gotten pretty far into a few things and gotten pretty okay at them over the years. So I think from a really early age, what has driven me to this, it's sort of twofold. I think it's just part of my nature. I think I've just always been really curious and nosy and interested. And I for me, that's really based in love of storytelling. And I love learning about different things that different people do and why they do them. And sometimes I'm like, that's a cool thing. I want to try it. So that's what gets me involved in actually doing the things as opposed to just maybe relating the story or hearing someone tell the story. One of my freelance gigs was writing for Wisconsin People and Ideas magazine, and I did a cover story about a woman who does basket weaving. I didn't know anything about that. And when I was first assigned, I had the very kind of shitty, like, oh, basket weaving, whatever. And I went and I talked to this woman, and it was fascinating. There's this whole history to it and this culture and like where she had picked it up from and people who did it. And I was like, oh man, yeah, don't be an ass about stuff like this, because remember, everybody's got their passion. So I'm the person who wants to flit between circles of people and cultures and things like that and just learn about them. And honestly, I think the other half of that was when you have a parent who dies when you're very young, it's sort of very stark moment of you got one shot. as far as you know. So you might as well go out and do the things you want to do right now, because who the heck knows what's going to happen tomorrow.
So I want to ask you a little bit about writing for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. I know one of the things that I've heard you tweet about and write about a little bit is kind of the responses you get to writing these political columns. How do you absorb that kind of stuff? I mean, because that can be a drag, whether you have a thick skin or not. It can be a lot to be talking about politics in a public way these days. How do you handle that?
Yeah, good question. I think everybody's got a different approach to it. Mine has evolved over the years. I started just by blogging on a personal blog years back, and then got picked up by Isthmus to do basically a blog on their website. And that's where I started to sort of deal with the first public responses to my opinions. Now, I have always been a person with opinions. I've never been too shy about sharing them. And I've certainly faced a lot of blowback. I think a lot of it was very gendered. I know it was, because it was, a lot of the responses are like, "Oh, shut up, little girl." You're like, okay, well, you've just ceded the argument to me, because clearly you have nothing of worth to counter with. But for whatever reason, and sheer cussedness, I've never let that stop me. And I'm sort of like, well, that's your gift. Like, you gotta do that, which means that I feel like I have the responsibility to really try to learn and be responsible in that role, and be open to when I've made mistakes, and try to get information from lots of different people who have more experience than I do. But at the same time, try to use that platform for some amount of good. And because I think some people aren't in places where they can put themselves out and make themselves that vulnerable, or don't have access to those platforms for various reasons. So I try to remember that like I have this privilege to do this thing, and I also apparently have the temperament to be just interested in doing it in the first place. So I should use that. That said, obviously, no matter how thick, like you said, no matter how thick your skin is, like some of this stuff gets to you for sure. I haven't dealt with anything super terrible. Like I knock on wood, I have not been subject to like doxing or anything like that yet. I say yet for whatever reason, but I have definitely fielded my fair share of pretty horrible, heinous insults and attacks. Very little of it has happened in person, is interesting. This is all through email and social media and stuff like that. So one of the techniques I use, and I've sort of developed over the years, is my Journal Sentinel column has an email address for myself listed on it. I literally only use that email address for that column. And I don't attach it to my normal email address. I don't see it constantly. I have to actually specifically log into this account to see that stuff. Mm-hmm. So I set like a time, maybe a couple times a month at most, to sit down and go through those, just so that it's not a constant drag. It's been a pleasant surprise, though, the response to that column, like the people who write emails. There's a good like 40% who are just straight up really lovely and complimentary. Which I wasn't expecting that many, like people to take time to say a good thing. There's actually quite a few people who do, which is lovely. And
that's amazing.
All over the state too. Get like 70, 80-year-old little old ladies from like in the middle of nowhere, northern Wisconsin, writing, being like, "Thank you for this." Jeez, that's so rewarding. And then there's like, another 20% that are maybe not 100% in agreement with me, but are willing to engage in sort of an interesting dialogue, or have some information that's really valuable or something to offer a story. And I love that. Those are really good to engage with. And then the rest are like a combination of just sort of like, "Oh, typical liberal from Madistan, whatever." I'm like, okay, whatever. It doesn't hurt me. That's just, it is what it is. And then there's a small percentage of people who are really, really heinous. And you can see it coming a mile off is the thing. So I'll open an email, and if like the first sentence is just crazy pants, I don't read the rest of it. I'm like, I don't need to internalize that. I don't need to bring that into my brain at all. I make exceptions for like 2 people because they are regulars. They write me after every column basically to, rake me over the coals. There's one man who's allegedly some kind of doctor. I think he's like a chiropractor or something. And a woman. And they write me constantly about how much they hate me. And I'm like, but you read every column. You are providing hits to the website or a subscription to the paper. You're constantly threatening to stop because you're like, Journal Sentinel's full of crap, and because they carry you and I hate them. And I'm like, but you're still reading and you write me every time, which I think is kind of adorable. I also think it's probably just a good idea to keep an eye on your regulars in case, someone goes off the rails and starts to be like, oh, that's maybe a threat I need to take seriously. Fortunately, that has not happened yet, but I find that really fascinating. So I try to create barriers for myself, boundaries, to give myself space to and I have a life. Like I have a life outside of that. And I have a really wonderful support network of friends and loved ones who have my back. And that makes a huge difference. Like I don't feel isolated and alone. And I'm also, again, I'm willing to eat shit when I've actually made a mistake. It sucks. It's really hard. I want to get defensive about it, but I have absolutely made mistakes, and I try to be really transparent about that and forthcoming. And I think that has helped lower the amount of invective that gets directed at me, honestly. So yeah, it's been an interesting, and it's an ongoing learning process for sure, but that's kind of how I deal with it. And I try to meet people with good faith too. Other than the really crazy pants ones that are like, there's no engaging with this, I really try to always respond in a way that assumes there is a good person behind this who we probably have something in common. We got to figure out where that is and maybe go from there. And amazingly, I've actually been able to connect with some people who came at me initially being very, very dismissive and on the other side of an issue. And the being a PK thing is coming really handy because I can be like, well, you want to talk Bible verses? Let's go. Like, I can talk to you about the Bible because there's a lot of assumptions that people will come in and be like, you must be a heathen. Your parents hated you and did drugs and you've probably got all this abuse in your past. And I'm like, this is a really interesting psychoanalyst and you are wrong about all of it. So let's talk about that. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I feel like all those small victories are worth it just to humanize each other. Them to me and me to them.
Tell me a little bit about the process of pulling together a weekly political article, opinion article. How do you develop your ideas and kind of put them out there?
It's interesting. It's hard. It's sort of hard to put this in a specific process because I've been doing this for so many years and it's changed over times. But I do talk to people about this. I'm like, it is challenging to have an opinion on a schedule. I will say, like, you got to have a really strong opinion or thoughts about something once a week. And I admire people who do it more frequently than that, frankly. For me, I mean, I'm just someone who really tries to stay aware of what's going on out in the world. So I read a lot of news. I engage with a lot of analysis and opinion writing and just what's out there in general. So I'm pretty aware of it. And I have an admittedly pretty slapdash system for this because I have an email draft in my Gmail that's just dedicated to me dropping in story links or notes or whatever as they come up. Because when it comes down to like the time I have allotted every week to sit down and write the piece, I want to have something in mind already. If I sit down at that point and I have nothing going at all, it's terrifying. You're just staring at it like, oh God, what the heck do I write about? And there's a million things in the world. You could write about so many things, but I think that's part of what makes it overwhelming. But also, like, I want to feel like I have something of worth to say, to add to this. I don't want to just copy what someone else has already put out into the world or just echo something or just whine completely about something either. I want to have something original to contribute to the debate. So that's why I try to just sort of constantly make these notes and references and like, here's a news story about this thing and here's where something else was related. And I just collect that constantly. And then I can go and pick and like what seems the most timely of those things to write about. But then I've still got other stuff in the back pocket for those weeks that seem like slower news weeks or something that's a more ongoing long-term subject or something like that. And that's how I approach it. And there are weeks too where like I sit down to write and something is just breaking. And I have trained myself over the years, like I can write, they're not always necessarily my best columns, but I can write a column in about an hour if need be. It's not my ideal. But when something is really like a breaking thing, and occasionally once in a blue moon, the editors will actually ask me to respond specifically to something. And that will be sometimes a little bit faster turnaround as well. But I appreciate the editors I've worked with at the Sentinel, David Haynes mostly, have been super hands-off. They don't tell me what to write about. They don't yell at me about anything. They don't discourage me from anything. Just once in a while, they'll check in and be like, hey, Christian Schneider wrote about this. Do you want to respond to it? I'm like, yes, I do. That sounds fun. Or they just want like a perspective specifically because I think I'm like the token female, queer, sort of young liberal. I'm like, you could hire other opinion writers who fill those. It doesn't all have to be this one me and a bunch of dudes. I'm just saying. Gonna keep nudging you toward that. But yeah, so that's basically how it works.
Well, I mean, I guess that kind of brings up a point. It's like, do you feel a responsibility to be the voice of that for that paper? I mean, you know what I mean? Like, do you feel a responsibility to talk about those issues that affect your community? I mean, how do you view your place in the scheme of that entire paper?
Yeah, I absolutely do take that responsibility seriously. I think anybody who is given a platform like that has to. They don't all do it, but it's you have a responsibility to sort of elevate the things that you have more direct access to or experience with that maybe don't get covered otherwise. So fortunately for me, a lot of those things are things that I am passionate about. So I talk a lot about LGBT issues, and I take a lot of flack for it from people like, why are you always talking about transgender rights and this, that, blah? I'm like, well, because it's important. And you should care about it because these are human beings. Also, I have this direct connection to this community. I have friends and family and myself for queer issues. So yes, I'm going to talk about these things, but I think of it as a responsibility to talk about them. I will say I balance that though with trying never to feel pushed to write about something in a certain way, because there are definitely areas where I have opinions and thoughts and ideas that don't line up with like a specific flavor of liberalism or like neoliberalism particularly. I'm not a hardliner for much of anything other than like women's reproductive access. I'm a hardliner for that. Like 100%, I'm sorry, it's done. Basic human rights, obviously 100% hardliner on that. But, there's a lot of issues where there was a guy coming at me on Twitter about like, I retweeted, I think, something that Eric Holder said about the FBI being like, he was responding to an attack by Trump and defending the FBI as a bunch of like good people doing good work. And like, yes, obviously I'm aware the FBI has a pretty bumpy history and has done some pretty heinous things, and it is not, but it's not black and white. Nothing is ever black and white. So anyway, I retweeted Eric Holder's tweet as just sort of like this is a tweet of note. And this guy just comes at me about like, how dare you not recognize that the FBI once murdered the head of the Black Panthers and this, that. And then I'm like, I've talked about this before. One, I'm aware of it. I am totally there. But once I, pushed back gently on this, the person just flies off the handle. It's like, you're not liberal enough. You don't understand. You're just a mouthpiece of the neoliberals, and you're a centrist and all this and blah, blah, blah. And like starts calling me all these other names, insults, basically. I'm like, all right, blocked, done. I don't need to engage with that. It's funny how that comes from the extremes of any ideology I'm not particularly interested in.
Yeah, and I think that brings up, you brought up Twitter, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that. It does seem to be this, like, if you're not 100% with me on everything, then I'm going to tear you down.
Yeah.
What do you make of that? Just, have you seen that grow over the course of the last 10 years? I mean, where's your mind at?
I try to take a pretty historical long view of this. I'm a huge history nerd. So it's so funny, like some of it feels, things have definitely changed. We're in a brave new world where we've got social media and a 24-hour news cycle. Like things are definitely unprecedented in many ways. And I think we are in a period right now of extreme polarization. I think that's happened before, though. I think this is a new iteration of it, just given technology and current state of things. It's sort of super accelerated and hyper that. But like this has happened before. Like America has never been this beautiful panacea of like compromise and meeting everybody in the middle and viewing everybody as a human and like great society. Like it's never been the case. It has been for certain segments of the society, but not all of America. So I really try to take that long view of like things change. I'm always striving for myself to remember that everybody's a human being, and like, which is why I don't like those extremes. Like everything's pretty gray. You gotta engage with the grayness. I try to be a mix of like having my boundaries and having my principles and ideals, but also trying to understand, I think especially within more liberal circles, if we're talking especially about like queer people and stuff, there are people who are very defensive, and if you get the smallest thing wrong, they're going to come at you and attack you. And I don't think that's healthy or viable, but I do understand where it comes from when you're talking about a population that has been incredibly traumatized. People who've grown up and had to carve out and fight tooth and nail for every piece of air that they breathe and every ground that they stand on. Like that's traumatizing, and it can make you really defensive and view everything as an attack. And I understand that. I can feel it. I have some experience with that for sure. And I have compassion for it. And that's what I try to remember even on the people who are on the far end of the spectrum from me, way more right-wing, who are the same way. It's like something has happened to you in your life, some experience, some socialization, whatever, that you just got into this place where you just, everything is a fight. I want that to not be the case. Sounds exhausting. It's exhausting for me when that was the case. And I'm just trying to find that middle ground between, I'm not going to give space to like racist ideology and stuff like that. I'm not gonna I understand, I have compassion for you. So go ahead and spout out this hateful rhetoric and pass these hateful laws. No. However, trying to at least understand where the person is coming from and can really help you frame how you approach the situation. And maybe, if we all remembered that we're all dealing with our own traumas and stuff like that, some valuable perspective would be added to the debates, and I think would make things a little healthier for everybody. It's tricky. It's certainly tricky.
Is that a product? Do you think that's all a product of the way in which you grew up with a parent that you said didn't necessarily understand everything, but was basically with you, was basically on your side? Maybe they weren't like 100% said the right thing all the time. Do you feel like that's maybe where you got some of that more understanding?
I mean, absolutely have to credit both of my parents and a lot of the people who were around me growing up. We were raised in a house where we were supported in who we were, and we could have discussions and sometimes fights, about stuff without ever feeling like we were going to be excommunicated from the family. I really appreciated that intellectual curiosity and just sort of fundamental human compassion that they showed. And both of them, I'm not going to say that either of my parents are perfect people. We're not going to go into that. However, I think where they get it right is that both of them are always super committed to, doing their best and trying to meet people in the middle and really seeking out ways to connect and support. My mother was a teacher. She was a public school teacher. And one of the big projects she was always engaged in was like an after school, like reading program for kids who were sort of behind the curve or didn't have as much support. And I don't think she get paid for it, but she did it because she was really committed to that. And, things like that sort of set really good examples. Even if you're a total twit as a kid and you don't quite consciously understand what that is, there's no denying the influence that being surrounded by that sort of unconditional love and outreach and intellectual curiosity. Like my dad is a minister. He was a philosophy major in undergrad and then got his divinity. And he's, really into the philosophers and like the historical context of the Bible and stuff like that. All these things were like really wanting to engage with. Like for him, like I've since left the Christian faith. I'm not a religious person, but I have a lot of respect for his and other people's approach to religion and spirituality when it's like, I don't have all the answers, and this isn't like a hard and fast thing, and I don't really want to impose this forcibly on other people. I want to like engage, and I want to explore those questions, and I want to have doubt and deal with that doubt. That's all part of all of this is like a willingness to understand that like no one has all the answers, and you should question authority, and you should have compassion, and you should let people be themselves. That makes a huge, huge impression as a kid. And I was allowed to do that by my family. And I was encouraged to do that for others.
So all those things you just said seem incongruent with like being on Twitter.
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of curious, like your opinion, because you're on Twitter a lot. You make political commentary on Twitter a lot,
and I get snarky sometimes. I'm fully aware of that.
and I guess my question is like in the era of Trump, in the era of all of this, all these things that we've been talking about, is like social media worth it? Like why?
Oh,
like, what, do you ever think about just like logging off and that's it?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Frequently. So much of my sort of professional life is tied up in being on social media. I mean, just from like managing Facebook pages and blah, blah, blah. But it's like anything, any great tool, the internet itself, this great tool can be used for good or for ill. And in the end, I'm never going to advocate for getting rid of something wholesale because it does do enormous good for certain people. Just the access to having these online communities through Twitter, through Facebook, for whatever, and I'm going to go back to, again, my experience with like queer people, is some of these kids who, like when I was in Oklahoma, I had very early proto-internet that I was part of. I was on like an IRC chat channel with friends, like, I used to be on like bulletin board systems way back in the day, like really closed. Those were crucial lifelines for me though. If you couldn't if you didn't feel like you had anybody really to connect with on that level, like in your school, which is what you've got available to you as a kid, you could go online and connect with some people elsewhere and find people with similar experiences. And now you can find resources, you can find community, you can find places to just vent. Like Tumblr is a huge one for queer people, queer kids especially. There's a huge queer kid presence on Tumblr, and it's a lot of just like stupid venting and like silly memes and whatever. But like that is so crucial to have that. And you'll start to meet people who have experiences that you can draw from, and like role modeling and just access to information. So like that is a lifeline for some people. And I'm positive, and I know for a fact that that applies to many other communities. And I think there's enormous good. I mean, Twitter, for me, the positive things that I get on it are lurking on like Black Twitter, basically. I learned so much. And I think Black Twitter is probably one of the most vibrant, if you're going to click a section of Twitter that exists. There's this wonderful community there that disagrees with each other and is not a monolith by any means. But I have learned a lot by simply being quiet and watching and learning and listening to those voices, because that is not my personal experience. And there's so much good that comes out of that. There's organization. There's, the anti-sexual harassment movement and stuff that really spread through Twitter. There's a lot of women who are in media and stuff that I've connected with through Twitter and Facebook who use those as invaluable professional networking resources, but just like personal connection and like, can you relate to this terrible thing that's happened? Can we find a way to organize around it? So I still see enormous good that comes from a lot of it. I see enormous ill use and bad. And I think we all could do better to set more boundaries for ourselves, for sure. And one of the things I actually did, it's such a small thing, but it's made incalculable benefit to my mental health, is I do not pick up my phone first thing in the morning. And I give myself an hour where I don't look at my phone. I get up, I make a breakfast, I sit down, I read a book, and I eat. And that's how I start my day. So one, I was missing reading books. Like social media was starting to pull me away from like reading, which I love. So just giving myself set periods of time throughout the day where I'm like, you are going to disconnect for this hour at least. And especially that first thing in the morning and right before bed too. Like, there have been studies written about this and like psychological studies and stuff like that, but like the importance of not having blue light before you go to bed and things like that. But that's very real for me. So having given myself that boundary, like do not pick up your phone first thing in the morning. It's a hard habit to break. I like noticed a marked improvement in how I felt during the day.
I think that's a strategy I should adopt.
I keep telling people about this.
That's a great idea.
It's it worked so well for me.
Don't let it consume all of your life.
Right. Give yourself boundaries. Like boundaries are so important for so many things in our lives. And I think that's something that can get lost in the hustle and bustle of the modern world.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about Our Lives magazine. You said you've been doing it for about 5 years now. When somebody gets that magazine, reads that magazine, what do you want them to feel, or what do you want them to get from it? What's kind of the purpose of the content that you're putting out there? Role
modeling. It's role modeling and community connection. Those are the two big sort of watch phrases for us. It's me and Patrick Faribaugh. He's the founder and publisher, and that's literally the staff of this magazine. Which is fun because it's sort of this double-edged sword where people are like, your magazine is beautiful. It's this full color, really well designed, because Patrick has a long history in magazine publishing. He's really good as a graphic designer. So you must have much like a great staff and money. And I'm like, nope, there's two of us and we barely make anything. But we have a great community of support and volunteers and freelancers that we do pay as often as we possibly can. And it's all about like what he founded it for was he moved to Madison from a big city and he was looking for a place to kind of lay down roots and build community, like have community connection. So the magazine is sort of one of a kind as far as we can tell in the entire United States, especially for queer media. It's not nightlife focused overwhelmingly. We have nightlight stuff in there, but it's not the main focus. We don't even take booze or cigarette ads or sex ads, which is also a big thing in LGBT media. We do occasional booze ads if there's like a local distiller or brewery or something like that. That's cool. But it's all focused on like personal narratives and stories about what the folks in your town are doing. And we try to profile as many people who do as many things in different walks of lives. And we rely on like recommendations from all sorts of folks. Like, who can we talk about? Who can we put in here? Who's doing what resources exist for people, and try to just tackle as much of the spectrum as we can so that someone can pick this up and use it as a resource if they are looking to connect with someone or an organization, or they need a service, and they need a recommendation from something they can trust to be sort of LGBT friendly, information about, what's happening in the law at any given time, resources for mental health, everything. So yeah, it's role modeling and community building as much as possible, just to provide that as a resource. And we've gotten really good response to that. I think people really appreciated that. And I wish that existed in more parts of the country, honestly.
I remember when Patrick started it, it was 2007. And I remember thinking at the time, like, you're crazy.
Right.
Like, why are you starting a print publication now? Like, this is like crazy. There's like the economy's tanking. There's newspapers just laying people off left and right. Like, nobody's investing in print right now. Like, what are you doing?
Yep.
But did he know something at that time that we didn't know, that I didn't know? Or was it just the sense that, like, this needs to happen?
I think it was just a sense of this needs to happen. And I think sometimes you need someone who's a little audacious and maybe a little naive. And he wasn't. Like, Patrick, had worked in New York magazines, and he'd been homeless for a short while in New York. And, he dealt with, he knew what the economy was. But I think he was so passionate about this, and it was so unique because he hadn't seen it anywhere and no one else had really seen it anywhere, that he was like, I want this to be a thing that exists, so I'm going to make it happen. And I know it was really hard for the first couple of years convincing even the community itself, the LGBT community, that he was trustworthy as a human. He's a white cis gay man, so there are some people who have an inherent distrust of that being like the head of something, and I get that. So he really had to hustle to establish like trust and outreach, and really just because it was basically just him for a while doing everything, and trying to pull in as many people as he could to start to help. So it was a real labor of love for a long time for him. And fortunately, his vision and his commitment to outreach and really listening and trying to give that platform to other people, so he wasn't the focal point of it, I think made it work. And I think people started to value it. And fortunately, when you start getting community support and, local advertisers and things like that, who are like, I see value in being part of this because there's nothing else like it. And this is like really important to support this community. And I do get some return on this investment because there's nothing else like this. It is such a unique thing. People seek it out specifically for what it is. And I know people who've used it basically like they use the ads in the magazine as like a resource guide for like, who should I go to when I need this, that, or the next thing, because I know that they're supporting this community thing, this community publication. So I'm not going to say that it's easy and that we don't have ups and downs for finances. I mean, it is super challenging. It is very challenging. So like, it's great that it's gone as well as it has. And I think that's a lot of hard work and dedication and community support, but who knows, like it's always touch and go from year to year, from month to month, really.
People have a multitude of different ways of identifying themselves, whether it's their gender, their sexual orientation, or just in life in general. Yeah. And when words are in print, people are they're very particular about print. It's maybe different than when you're having a conversation with somebody. When it's in print, it's there.
It lives there.
It's live there. Yeah. So how do you handle, what kind of considerations do you make? I know the AP Style Guide has, some recommendations on certain things, but not everything. Yeah. What kind of considerations do you make in how you identify people in the magazine?
So there's a couple different avenues that we take. We follow the AP Style Guide for the most part for the magazine. That's what we refer to for most things. But we've had to kind of develop our own custom way to handle, especially like gender identity and sexual identity. So there's a disclaimer in every issue that says, like appearing in Our Lives magazine does not necessarily infer or imply anything about this person's sexual identity or gender identity. Because we have people in there all sorts of, for all sorts of reasons. They might just be an ally or whatever, but sadly, it's sort of to legally cover our asses too, because there's people who are like, well, I'm in this magazine and you're implying something about me. I'm like, no. Unless we specifically call something out. And when we specifically call something out, we ask the person how they want to identify as much as possible. There are definitely times where like we're referring more in like a reported piece and we don't really know. And it'd be kind of awkward sometimes to just reach out to someone cold and be like, what's your sexual identity or what's your gender identity? Like it can be super awkward and really impersonal. And it could be really insulting. So as much as possible, I do try to just make it a blanket part of like when I'm talking to someone, like what pronouns do you use? And how do you identify? And I let them tell me. And I just, whatever they tell me is what I put in. To the point of like, there are new terms that I'm unfamiliar with. I'm 36 years old, and the generations that are younger than me have a whole wide variety of terms they're trying out. And, even for me, I'm like, oh my God, this is a lot and it's weird and I don't understand it. I'm like, but it's okay. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, how I feel about it doesn't matter is what it is. So if they're telling me that this is how they identify, that's what I'm going to use. I'm not going to question it. I'm not going to make a point. I'm not even going to call it out. So a good example of that is we had a young person who was featured we have like a section dedicated to people who are like college age and under specifically. And I think I put them in the issue as with she, her pronouns. And this person reached out and very, very kindly, like it was not an attack. It was like, you know what? I didn't call this out and let you know that my pronouns are actually fae, fair. This is a new one to me. It's like FAE, like as in like a fairy. And when to me, I'm like, oh, I wouldn't have even thought that that's a thing. And I was like, but you know what? Like, it's not worth hurting someone who's working on their identity and like growing up and exploring and feels a connection to this thing to be like, why on earth do you use that? Like I feel the same way. Like people, like I'm totally cool with they, them. That's no problem. And there's people who really struggle with that. And I'm like, it's fine for you to struggle with that. Do it internally, work it out privately, but just respect the pronoun. Just use it. Like, don't make it a big deal. So I really try to adhere to that as much as possible. And sometimes we F up and we have to make corrections because we failed to ask. And that's a failure on our part. I will always take that on as like, if we didn't have the time to ask or seek it out from someone who knew or whatever, like, and we made an assumption and used something and then we're wrong. So we've definitely effed it up a few times, but we really just try to ask and then just respect what the person tells us as much as possible.
I want to go back a little bit to maybe the first time that I became aware of you in Madison, and maybe a lot of people in Madison became aware of you, which is probably from Twitter or from some other sources in regard to the massive Capitol protests in 2011.
Yeah.
Which is about 7 years ago now.
It's crazy.
Can you tell me a little bit about what you were up to when that was happening?
Yeah, let me try to dig back into my memory banks here. I mean, so the reason I was down there I was down there from day one because I went and covered the Valentine's Day thing where like the TAA brought the Valentines to Walker's office and dumped this big box of Valentines. And they were sort of on the bleeding edge of being aware that something was coming down the pike that was going to be big and controversial and attack teachers specifically. And I showed up because I was part of Dame 101, which was a sort of really grassroots early media effort that Jesse Russell and Shane Welty and Kyle Nablisi all formed way back when. And I jumped on a couple years into it and had sort of become more and more involved. And I was really interested in politics and local politics and covering things. And I had no traditional news background. I had no access to being a traditional reporter at that time. But it made us really flexible. So we were there right away. And I was like, I got wind. I think actually Dave Blaska posted something in Isthmus. He was like my Isthmus nemesis for a long time. Real right-wing fella. He posted something where he was like, I bet you, I have inside knowledge that Walker is going to put this provision out that's going to basically get rid of public sector unions. And I remember reading the piece like a couple days before and kind of taking note, but also kind of writing it off. And some other people being like, no, that's not going to happen. But fortunately, I was just keeping an eye out when the TAA said they were going to do this thing. And I was like, well, I'm going to go to this and check it out and report on it. Expecting to show up and it be like the million other Madison protests I've been to, where it's like maybe 100, 200 people show up, kind of the usual suspects, a lot of the aging boomers crowd who are just like dedicated and come to everything. And I show up and it's immediately apparent this is different. You know, it was much larger, it was much younger and already pretty diverse. And so I followed and I covered it. We put it up on Dame 101 and it was just sort of like, the next day it happened again, and the next day it happened again, and it kept getting bigger. So we were always down there every single day. And I at the time, I didn't have a smartphone. I had just a regular, like I could send a text to Twitter to post. So I was sending these updates, but I was blind. I couldn't see any responses or anything like that. And my poor, long-suffering, now husband was very kind, and he was at home on his computer, and he would check the updates, and he would text me back if someone asked a question, like to clarify something or respond to something. So then I would tweet out blind to this person in response based on what he was texting me. And like halfway through the hubbub, I remember he was like, "We're getting you a smartphone. I can't do this anymore. You have to be able to check it yourself." The downside is that old dumb phone, the battery on that lasted forever. So like I could have it down in the Capitol like for 2 days without having to recharge. And I got this smartphone and I have to like plug in constantly. So that was an interesting technology switch for me at that time. But I remember tweeting out a picture the first time there was a big crowd in the rotunda, really. And it went super viral, this picture, because I think it was really the first picture that went out on social media that showed sort of the enormity of what was happening. And like Michael Moore's website picked it up and asked if they could put it on their main page and a couple other places and stuff. And I was like, whoa, this is getting big. And then people started to notice that Dame 101 was really on the ground. And so we started getting, a lot of our stuff started getting picked up by more national press and shared. And then people were actually like coming to us to ask questions and like, what's actually happening on the ground? Because pretty quickly the narrative started to spin all weird and the national press would cover things, right wing or not, just kind of wrong. And it was a really fascinating experience. Like I knew intellectually that like media gets things wrong and can twist things or just miss the mark or whatever. It was very fascinating and very eye-opening to be right there in the midst of something and seeing the reporting and being like, what the hell are you even talking about? Like, no. And just seeing how the narrative could get co-opted by different people. And so our big motivation for continuing to be there and putting out these stories and like just trying to talk to people who are on the ground as much as possible was to counter not even like the partisan bent of anything, but was just sort of like, these are the people who are here and this is what they're saying. It's not people being bussed in from other states. Like I'm walking around the Capitol. This is all like very obviously Wisconsin-y, like moms and dads and their kids and stuff like that. And you could just walk up and talk to anybody. And like 90% of the time they were a Wisconsinite. So we were really kind of dedicated to that. But we were also like, I crawled through a window at one point when they were like nailing things shut and you couldn't get access to things. And we had people who happened to be on the inside when something got locked. So we would talk to each other. And we were kind of the only organization that had that much flexibility to be there and to be kind of everywhere and to get stuff out really quickly and all that. So it was a scary responsibility kind of in a way that we didn't intend to have, but kind of ended up in the middle of. So, and then I think because I was one of the people tweeting really regular updates using that and kind of jumping onto the We Union hashtag, which was being used at the time, my stuff just started to spread around simply because I had information. And so I got hooked into, I met a lot of people through that, like a lot of people that I'm still friends with to this day through various other means. We initially met through Twitter and that hashtag and that action of being down at the Capitol. And people that I met, like, Jenny Dye, who's since gone on to be a county supervisor and stuff. Her activism was born out of that whole thing. She was just, regular gal at that point, hadn't really gotten involved in anything. And now she's like kick-ass, super involved, political activist, all this stuff. So it's been really cool to watch people sort of have their awakenings through that in various ways.
Was it an awakening for you in some sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I've had a completely non-traditional journey to and through media and journalism, and that continues to be the case. I felt really motivated by a lot of what happened, and I've been all the more dedicated to sort of like following along with what's happening in Wisconsin, understanding the history, and trying to fight for better since Walker's been in office ever since then. So like through the recalls and everything. It really galvanized me. And I, people are like, are you going to run for office? I'm like, not right now, maybe someday, but I've got other things I need to do first before that's the outlet that I want to consider pursuing. So it was a big learning experience overall.
Part of the protest was a little bit to occupy the Capitol in some sense, to be there, to not let the legislators kind of lock people out or just
to force them to take testimony.
Right.
Yeah.
To be there. And I think some people spent the night at the Capitol. Was that something you did as well?
I never once spent the night. I will say that. There were other people who were very dedicated who did, but I lived so close by. It was easy for me to get in and out. And I was there for like, whole days at a time. But I was like, I am going to kill myself if I stay here overnight, given that I'm reporting all day. So I was like, I'm gonna go home and sleep in my own bed. I have the privilege of having that being a nearby option. So I never actually slept over, but I was there for like 12-hour days. And then we did have some people who were reporting for Day 101 who did stay. And I had a lot of friends who stayed as well, who would camp out. And they, that was more of the people who were like straight activists. And I think my form of activism has often been to observe and report. And it's not to say I don't get involved. Like, I have an opinion, and that's why I don't do beat reporting and stuff like that. But even still, like when I was at these protests and stuff, like I wasn't carrying a sign and chanting. I was taking pictures. I was talking to people. That's what I feel more comfortable doing. And I feel like that's what I have a gift, a talent or a skill at, I guess you would say. And so that's what I want to do. Whereas I feel kind of uncomfortable being the shouty, sign carrying marcher. Like, weirdly, though I'm mostly an extrovert, I have some very introverted qualities, and it makes me really like nervous and uncomfortable. So I appreciate people who do that, and that's great. And I think that's a approachable thing that anybody can do. But I really enjoy having a job when I'm at things like that, basically, like having a task. So that's what I was doing, as opposed to being sort of more down in the trenches.
Looking back now on that time, what do you think about most when you reflect on it? Do you think about it a lot?
Off and on. Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where you're like, boy, it's so interesting to have been part of this really exciting thing that was like a wave. It was like everything was condensed, everything was happening, and there was so much possibility, and it was so invigorating and motivating. And now, since that's, we don't have this like everyday big protests, come together, community bond thing, we're all back out just doing the hard work now. So trying to find ways to stay motivated and excited and enthusiastic when you're just doing the work and you don't have as many times to come together in these big momentous occasions that feel historic. Everything is historic, but it's just easier to point to those moments as like big points, right? So trying to find ways to carry that energy over and see like where good has come of it. Because, it can feel really dispiriting to be like, well, Walker's still in office. The recall didn't work. Maybe that wasn't the best tactic to have taken at the time. And there's some good analysis to be done of how things were handled and where, the big party apparatus and some of the big organizations came in and kind of co-opted what was a very grassroots people's movement. And there's room for criticism there. But I also see that it's less immediately visible, but things have changed in the state since then, and people got galvanized. They went back to their communities, and they are doing the hard work. They've formed organizations. They've run for public office. They've gotten involved in even just like super hyper local, which is important. I think that was a point that really helped charge a lot more people all at once up to go out and do this work. So things take time. It's only been 7 years, right?
I wanted to ask you about something else you do. We mentioned before you just do everything. So but I wanted to ask you about roller derby because it's roller derby season here in Madison now.
This is how I work out a lot of my aggression from like politics and stuff like that. I get to like constructively go and play a contact sport. It's great.
How did you first come to roller derby? Like, how did you first get involved? And then I want to know like how you chose your name.
Oh, sure. Fortunately, I had someone tipped me off when the league here started in 2004 and started playing games, I think 2005. And I was at those first games at Fast Forward, like crammed in above the lockers. And I loved it. It was super campy, and they still had fake fights at that time for like the first year, I think, of the league. But it was fun. It was like this super underground punk rock kind of thing. You felt really cool just for being there, right? And I was like, oh, I totally want to do this. But I was like 24 or something at the time, and I had like no health insurance and no money and anything. So I was like, I can't do this. And then for years I was just a fan, and then I got involved as a photographer. I would go and take pictures of the games. And then finally I did try out once in 2006. I tried out, I got a call back, and then I got a job for something else, and I was like, I can't do it. So I didn't do it. And then I came back in like 2012, I want to say. I was like, I really want to make this work. And I'd watched the game evolve and change, and it was much more, it's all real. It's very athletic. There's a lot of strategy. It's a lot of hard work. And it was just even more and more appealing. As like, I've always been kind of a jock, but I never really felt like I fit in with any sport or any community around it. And this one, I was like, this feels right. This feels like a place that I could be myself. I can be kind of theatrical and campy, because I'm kind of that's kind of part of who I am. but I can also work really hard at a physical sport and a team sport and work with this community and like have this whole community because it's this whole worldwide thing. So it was very appealing on many levels. And so I tried out and I did not make it onto a Madrigal and Dolls home team that year. But fortunately, by that point, there was a recreational league. The Wreckers existed. So I had a place to go and skate for a year and keep training and meet people. And so I went back and tried out the second time. I got onto the quad squad, which was one of the home teams for MRD. And the rest is history. So it's been such a ride. I got into announcing for roller derby as well. And that's actually taking me to the UK in February for the Roller Derby World Cup, which I'll be announcing for in Manchester. It's crazy. Like you can get involved in so much if you want to. You can meet people and couch surf your way across the world if you want to, just through roller derby, because there are leagues everywhere. So, that's how I got involved. My name, so I'm a history nerd. And when I was trying to come up with my name, my partner and I were G-chatting with each other, just trying to come up with good puns that were like based on things that I liked or whatever. And I can't remember how we even came onto, but it's a reference to Hammurabi. The Code of Hammurabi is where we get an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It's one of the oldest written laws in human recorded history. It's an ancient Sumerian, I want to say, king called Hammurabi. And I was like, we were trying to think of puns based on that. So it sort of eventually developed into Hammer Abbey. And I was like, well, even if no one gets the reference, like Hammer's a cool name, like, right? That's cool. Like people like Hammer. Of course, everybody calls me Ham, which is more appropriate, honestly. And then my original number was I for I as a further reference to it because I'm a nerd. We can't have letters in our numbers anymore, so now my number is 141, which still kind of works. And I remember when I first started getting involved, like a lot of people don't get my name right away. They're like, oh, that's cool, whatever. But the refs got it because the referees by and large are all your like dungeon masters. They're hardcore nerds and like rules masters and tend to have a little bit more like
that's very fitting.
That. Yeah, it's yeah. I love our refs. Yeah, so that's the long and short of that story.
You mentioned it's kind of punk. Do you feel like there's a little bit of an overlapping community with punk? I mean, you do some music,
some punk music,
some punk music. Do you feel like there's a little bit of overlap there?
There is, yeah. I think it's really expanded over the years. I think it was much more in the early days, like that's all it was, like punk rockabilly scene. But it's expanded enormously. So all sorts of people from all walks of life, from like your squarest squares to your like crunchiest, radicalist queers and punks and stuff all do it. And it's cool because you get to meet people in the league like you would never cross paths with this person normally, but you have this thing in common and you can get along and it's really cool. So that is still there for sure. And we try to hold on to some of that DIY punk ethic. And by and large, we seem to hew to a really pretty progressive and ahead of the curve inclusiveness and like embracing of whatever and whoever you are, you come play derby. So yeah, it still exists, but like it's much expanded past that now too. And I appreciate that. It's more welcoming to more people, I think.
Do you find that for you personally, that punk music and roller derby and maybe some of the shows that you've organized, I know you've organized some shows or some gatherings. Do you think there's a political element to all of those things that you're involved in?
Yes, 100% yes. I think some people would want to disagree with me, and they're free to do so. But yes, all of this is political. Everything is political in its own way, simply because other people have made it an issue. You know, people talk like, oh, identity politics. I'm like, you made that an issue. This wouldn't be a political issue if you just let people be who they are. But, you know, we have to kind of cling to our identities and just simply by living as we are and being out about who we are and doing something like inventing a whole community in a sport for ourselves is revolutionary because it wasn't done. And it was a place where like, you know, we have a lot of trans athletes and people who identify all sorts of ways. So, you know, just by being out there and living your life authentically is a political act. And for better or for worse, like I would love to just be able to do this stuff and it's like fun and awesome and supportive and people feel good and have a good time and it's fulfilling and all that. And there was no political element to it, but that's not the world we live in. And I think that's imposed on us largely by a sort of overwhelming, you know, cultural narrative for so long that's like, you can only look this way, be this way, act this way. And I think that is limiting and damaging even to the people who think they do fit into those boxes. I think everybody's trying to be forced into these tiny little constricted spaces, and I think it's damaging to everyone. So I always say, like, patriarchy hurts everybody because it forces men to be in these specific boxes that are really stunting and harmful and emotionally crippling. And so, yeah, I mean, just like we have all sorts of folks. We have, men who identify as like cis straight men who come to Derby and, or in a punk band or whatever, and can wear like leggings and fabulous outfits and, whatever, embrace their feminine side. And it's fine. And it's healthy and it's holistic. And it's, again, in an ideal world, that wouldn't be a political statement, but it is. It absolutely is. And that's not my primary motivating factor for doing Derby and music and stuff. Like, I just love doing it. It's a great thing and a great place for me. It makes me feel good. And it's a good challenge, and I grow and learn. But that is an element that also helps drive me. And I'm committed to that. I want that to be something that people see, and I'm not ashamed of it. And I don't think there's any shame in that. I think we have to do that until it is no longer an issue.
I hate to ask this question as like a job interview question, but like, when you're 55 or 56, like, what do you want to be doing? Like, where do you want to be at?
I think about this occasionally, and I don't entirely know. I'm really bad at planning out long term. I'm very much someone who reacts to things as they come, or just like as I'm inspired to do something, I'll do that thing. So I'm really bad at predicting where I'm going to be at any given point. I know I'm still going to be writing in some capacity. I will still be playing music in some capacity. That's stuff that I will do for as long as as long as I'm breathing, I will find a way to do those things in some form. I suspect, if I had to guess, I will have run for office by that point, at least, even if I fail and don't make it. I think that's something that I would like to do at some point in my life. I'm still trying to work out in what capacity I feel like I would actually be useful. So I got to figure that out first. I don't want to go into it willy-nilly. So I think that's something that'll have happened. But yeah, I don't know, man. I don't know. I hope I'm still just seeking at that point in whatever capacity that is, and that I'm still traveling and still finding new stories and trying to use whatever skills and knowledge I've managed to cobble together over the years to hopefully continue to help build community, help provide, like, for myself. I mean, it's selfish too. It's like, it's for me to feel like there's community and connection is really important. And also bringing that for other people, like contributing that. As long as I'm still always doing something to that end, I think I'll be happy.
Thanks to Emily for sitting down with me. It was fun to connect. You can read Mills's work weekly in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel and regularly in Our Lives magazine. Additionally, Hammer Abbey has a podcast with co-host Allie Gator called Something Something Roller Derby, which you can find on your favorite podcast services. After you subscribe to that podcast, make sure to subscribe to the Wisconsin Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. Also, you can stay in the loop about the pod by visiting wispod.com and following the show on Twitter @WisPodcast and on Facebook @The Wisconsin Podcast. Cheers.